Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable and let yourself go, because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. Somewhere in the shadows of a dense, silent forest where the trees seem to whisper secrets and the air smells of damp earth and hidden mysteries, lies the Horizon Specialty Camp. Touted as a haven for children and adolescents with attitude problems, this place was better known for its relentless discipline than for its purported mission of juvenile rehabilitation. Located on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by impenetrable nature, Horizonte was a world apart, a labyrinth of strict rules, harsh punishments, and an oppressive atmosphere that made even the sunniest days seem gray. Parents sent their troubled children there in the hope that they would return transformed, but few knew what really went on behind those closed doors. But this time, the camp wasn't just shrouded in rumors. This time, there was death. It was at dawn when screams tore through the usual silence of the place. A group of monitors, concerned about the tardiness of one of the teenagers assigned to the solitary punishment cabin, burst open the door and discovered a scene that would freeze anyone's blood. The limp body of a young man lay face down on a threadbare mattress, his hands tied behind his back with nylon rope. It looked as if he had struggled until the last moment. Overturned furniture, broken glass strewn across the floor, bloodstains splattered on the grimy walls. It was evident that this small hut, used to isolate the troublemakers, had become the scene of a brutal tragedy. The corpse had multiple stab wounds, but what finally snuffed out the teenager's life was asphyxiation by strangulation. The rope that held his hands immobilized suggested premeditation, while the marks of resistance spoke of desperation and terror. Among the objects found at the scene were a broken hand lamp, the base of which bore traces of blood, a torn notebook with disturbing scribbles, and a silver lighter engraved with initials found under the mattress. What began as an attempt to correct unruly behavior ended up turning into a nightmare. The camp, designed to be a beacon of hope, was now embroiled in a murder case that left everyone wondering, who could have done such a thing? What kind of people lived and worked in this remote and secretive place? With each detail uncovered, the veil of normalcy that shrouded Camp Horizon began to crumble, revealing a web of tension, conflict, and uncomfortable truths. Leading the investigation was Detective James Alden, a police veteran known for his meticulousness and ability to solve complex cases. With his black trench coat and piercing gaze, Alden arrived at the camp ready to unravel the mysteries that surrounded him. His experience told him that nothing was what it seemed, and that in a place like this where emotions were always on edge, anyone could be guilty. As investigators tried to piece together what had happened, the forest seemed to hold even more secrets, whispers that no one wanted to hear, but which would eventually have to come to light. Jared Carter, a 16-year-old teenager, was a complex young man whose life was marked by both his intelligence and his behavioral problems. A student temporarily suspended for school fights, Jared had been described as a mixture of talent and conflict. Although his teachers recognized his creativity and ingenuity, they also admitted that he had difficulty controlling his temper when he felt provoked. His potential shone in moments of calm, but those moments were increasingly rare. He lived with his mother, Sarah Carter, a divorced social worker struggling to keep a fragmented family afloat. Jared's father had left home 5 years ago and was now living in another state, leaving an emotional void that was difficult to fill. Despite Sarah's efforts to guide him, Jared seemed to be constantly in trouble. His latest altercation, an incident of vandalism on public property, was the trigger that led to his being sent to specialized Camp Horizon. This place, touted as a haven for youth with attitude problems, became his prison. Since his arrival, Jared made no secret of his distaste for the camp's oppressive environment. Other students spoke quietly about the constant pressure and physical punishments that some monitors imposed under the guise of discipline. Over the past few months, Jared had repeatedly expressed his desire to escape, but the strict rules and constant surveillance made any attempt virtually impossible. His letters home were filled with frustration and veiled warnings about what was really going on there. However, before he could fulfill his dream of escape, his life came to an abrupt and tragic end. Jared's body was found in one of the farthest cabins of the camp, a place designed for solitary punishment. The circumstances of his death left everyone wondering what dark forces operated within Camp Horizon. and to what extent internal tensions had escalated undetected. Detective James Alden, known for his meticulousness and cunning, prepares to begin interrogations on a case that threatens to challenge all his skills. With an impeccable reputation and an eye capable of unraveling hidden truths, Alden enters the room determined to unravel the puzzle. His experience has taught him that every word, gesture, or silence can be key. Now, with unwavering focus, he begins his search for answers, knowing that the truth always leaves traces, even if they are hidden under layers of deception. Robert Simmons, a 42-year-old man with a cold stare and imposing posture, was one of the head monitors at the Horizon Specialty Camp. His reputation within the place was not exactly that of someone liked or admired. From the moment he joined the camp staff, Robert stood out for his extreme rigidity and lack of empathy for the teenagers under his care. He was known to mete out disproportionate physical punishment, often justifying it as necessary to correct undesirable behavior. But beyond the strict camp rules, there were persistent rumors of abuse that went far beyond what was acceptable. Former students had mentioned beatings, humiliating yelling, and long hours of solitary confinement as part of Robert's imposed regimen. Although no conclusive evidence was ever presented, these accusations made him a controversial figure even among his own colleagues. Prior to working at Horizonte, Robert had been a security guard at a juvenile prison, a job he left after facing multiple charges of inappropriate behavior. These charges included allegations of verbal and physical abuse, as well as accusations of psychological manipulation of young inmates. Although many of these cases were dismissed due to lack of cooperation from the victims, enough evidence remained to permanently tarnish his professional record. For Robert, Camp Horizon represented a new opportunity, although his methods remained just as questionable. In this new environment where teenagers were sent to be corrected, he found fertile ground to exercise his authority without significant restrictions. His presence in the camp was both a warning and a constant threat to those who dared to challenge him. The relationship between Robert and Jared, the murder victim, had been strained from the beginning. Jared, a rebellious and astute teenager, not only questioned the camp's draconian rules, but had also begun to organize other students to protest them. According to some of Jared's peers, he was determined to expose the abuses occurring within the camp, including the acts committed by Robert. The latter saw Jared as a direct threat to his control and the public image of the camp. Tensions between the two reached a peak when Jared threatened to leak evidence of mistreatment to local authorities if the unjustified punishments were not stopped. For Robert, this statement was like a ticking time bomb. He knew that if Jared kept his word, not only would his career be in jeopardy, but also his freedom. When Detective James Alden began investigating the crime, Robert Simmons was one of the first suspects to be questioned. During questioning, Robert maintained a calm but firm demeanor, denying any involvement in the murder. He explained that, during the estimated time of the crime, he was supervising evening activities in the camp's gymnasium. However, when investigators attempted to verify his alibi, troubling inconsistencies emerged. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Robert near the gym, but could not confirm exactly when he arrived or how long he stayed there. Others simply could not recall seeing him at all. The lack of solid testimony to support his version of events left a shadow of doubt about his innocence. As the investigation progressed, Detective Alden delved deeper into Robert's character and his relationship with Jared. What he discovered was a disturbing portrait of a man obsessed with absolute control, willing to do anything to protect his position and reputation. Reports gathered from other employees and students revealed that Robert used to keep a close eye on Jared, as if he feared the young man would reveal something compromising. It was even mentioned that days before the murder, Robert had had a heated argument with Jared in front of other students, although no one knew exactly what they said to each other. This incident, coupled with the growing hostility between the two, further fueled suspicions about Robert's role in Jared's death. The impact of this case went beyond the camp. The students' families began to demand answers, while local authorities initiated a thorough review of Camp Horizonte's policies and practices. For many, Jared's murder was not just an isolated crime, but the culmination of years of systematic abuse allowed under the cloak of discipline. And although Robert Simmons had not yet been convicted, every clue and every testimony seemed to weave a web that slowly cornered him, leaving Detective Alden certain that he would soon get to the bottom of the truth. Mia Thompson, A 35-year-old woman with an ever-serene face and a soft voice that seemed designed to calm emotional storms was the psychologist assigned to Camp Horizon. From the moment she arrived at the camp, Mia quickly earned a reputation for kindness and empathy. Students often described her as someone who listened without judgment, someone who seemed genuinely interested in helping them overcome their problems. Beneath that reassuring appearance, however, there were certain aspects of her work that generated controversy. Her therapeutic methodology, while endorsed by some colleagues within the field of youth psychology, was seen by others as too invasive. Rather than simply focusing on offering emotional support, Mia often pressured adolescents to confess traumas or inner conflicts, even when they denied having them. For many, this insistence crossed a dangerous line between professional help and manipulation. Jared had a complicated relationship with Mia from the beginning. Although Jared initially seemed willing to participate in therapy sessions, he soon began to show signs of resistance. According to several peers, Jared viewed Mia's interventions as useless and unnecessary. He believed that she was more interested in meeting institutional goals than in actually addressing the students' problems. This tension peaked during a group meeting where Jared, unable to contain his frustration, publicly exploded at Mia. He accused her of manipulating the students into admitting non-existent trauma, suggesting that she was doing so to justify her own importance within the camp. Jared's words were harsh and cutting, echoing around the room like an echo that everyone would later remember. For Mia, this incident was humiliating and deeply disturbing. Although she tried to maintain her composure in front of the others, those who knew her well noticed how this episode left a visible mark on her attitude. When Detective James Alden began investigating the crime, Mia Thompson was one of the names that naturally came up on the list of suspects. During questioning, Mia maintained a calm but defensive posture, explaining that she had no reason to wish Jared ill. According to her account, during the estimated time of the crime, she was reviewing medical files in her office until late. She explained that she had been working on updating important student-related records, something she claimed was part of her regular routine. However, when investigators sought to corroborate his alibi, troubling details emerged. His secretary claimed to have seen lights on in the office during unusual hours, but admitted that she did not interact directly with Mia at any time. This testimony, while not completely contradicting her version, left room for significant doubt. Was Mia really busy reviewing files, or did she take advantage of the solitude of her office to plan or execute something much darker? The conflict between Mia and Jared did not end with the public confrontation at the group meeting. According to some witnesses, tensions continued to escalate in the weeks that followed. Not only did Jared avoid participating in therapy sessions, but he also began to talk openly about filing a formal complaint against Mia with camp authorities. For Mia, these threats must have been especially alarming. She knew that if Jared succeeded in convincing other students to join his cause, he could jeopardize not only his position at the camp, but also his professional credibility. In addition, there were rumors that Jared had been gathering information about questionable practices within the camp, including some of the techniques used by Mia. This could have led Mia to lose control, especially if she felt that Jared posed an existential threat to both her career and her personal integrity. As the investigation progressed, Detective Alden carefully analyzed the dynamic between Mia and Jared, looking for patterns that might link her to the crime. What he discovered was a mix of plausible motivations and ambiguous behaviors. On the one hand, Mia's background as a psychologist showed no history of violence or out-of-the-ordinary behavior. She was a respected professional in her field, although her methods were the subject of debate. On the other hand, however, her relationship with Jared was marked by a growing mutual resentment that could have led to something more extreme. In addition, the fact that Mia had regular access to the more private areas of the camp, including the cabin used for solitary punishment, added another layer of suspicion to her profile. Although there was no conclusive physical evidence linking her directly to the crime scene, her lack of a solid alibi kept alive the possibility that she was involved. Lucas Bennett, a 17-year-old teenager with a defiant look and a posture always on guard, was another of the camp's residents. Although he shared the same fate as many of his peers, being there as a result of behavioral problems, Lucas stood out for his explosive temper and inability to control his emotions in conflict situations. From his first day at the camp, he had proven to be an impulsive young man. someone who responded to any provocation with hurtful words or even physical violence. He was known among the monitors as one of the most difficult students to handle, but also as someone who carried with him a deep insecurity that made him vulnerable to criticism or humiliation. The relationship between Lucas and Jared had been problematic from the beginning. Both were rebellious teenagers, but while Jared often asserted himself with his intelligence and cunning, Lucas relied on his physical strength and intimidating attitude. This created a dynamic of almost immediate rivalry between them, a silent competition for dominance within the group. Tensions slowly escalated until, weeks before the murder, they erupted into a brutal physical fight. According to witnesses, the confrontation occurred after Jared made a sarcastic comment about Lucas in front of other teammates. The public humiliation was too much for Lucas, who responded by lunging toward Jared in anger. The fight ended only when the monitors intervened, but the emotional scars left by that incident became a constant fuel for the mutual hatred the two felt. What made this rivalry even more troubling was the way Lucas vowed revenge on Jared. After the fight, several students overheard Lucas vowing to make him pay for the humiliation. While these statements were initially seen as simple, angry teenage bravado, they soon began to take on a more threatening tone. Some classmates claimed to have seen him muttering plans for retaliation, while others noticed how his behavior toward Jared became increasingly hostile. For Lucas, the humiliation was not something he could easily forget. It was an open wound that needed to be closed in cold blood. This context led Detective James Alden to set his sights on Lucas as one of the prime suspects in the crime. When it came time for questioning, Lucas maintained a defensive but firm attitude. He explained that, during the night of the murder, he had been sleeping in his bunk without moving or interacting with anyone. According to him, physical exhaustion after a full day of activities had plunged him into a deep sleep, from which he did not awaken until the following morning. However, when investigators sought to corroborate his alibi, troubling inconsistencies emerged. None of his roommates recalled seeing him move during the night, but neither could they guarantee that he had not crept out. In a place as chaotic as the camp, where strict rules made it difficult to truly rest, it was possible that someone like Lucas, with clear motivations and the ability to go undetected, could have taken advantage of the darkness to commit the crime and return to his bed undetected. Lucas's history within the camp added another layer of suspicion to his profile. He was known for getting into frequent fights and having trouble accepting authority, especially when it came from other students. His ability to hold grudges and plan retaliation had already been evident on other occasions. For example, months before the murder, Lucas had orchestrated a vicious prank against another classmate who had insulted him, making it clear that he did not hesitate to take extreme measures when he felt someone crossed a line. This pattern of behavior, along with the specific threats he had made against Jared, placed him at the center of speculation. Was it possible that Lucas, driven by rage and a desire for revenge, had decided to end the conflict in the most definitive way possible? Rachel Sanders, a 29-year-old woman with an impeccable bearing and a look that seemed capable of piercing anyone, was the camp's administrator. Since taking the position 3 years ago, Rachel had earned a reputation as an inflexible figure, someone whose only priority seemed to be maintaining absolute control over every aspect of the camp. Her leadership style was clear: strict rules, harsh punishments, and zero tolerance for any behavior she deemed out of line. Under her management, the camp's policies became more rigid, and while some employees acknowledged that these measures had succeeded in reducing certain disciplinary problems, others openly criticized her authoritarian approach. To many, Rachel was not only an administrator but also a constant shadow who watched every move within the camp, making sure that no one challenged her authority. What made Rachel especially interesting in the context of the case, however, was not only her leadership style but the persistent rumors about her relationship with Jared, the murder victim. Although she always maintained a professional distance from the students, some of Jared's employees and colleagues began to notice certain interactions between them that seemed to go beyond the usual. According to several witnesses, Rachel and Jared would often have long conversations during break times, talks that seemed to center on personal topics and shared tastes, something unusual between an administrator and a student. These encounters, though seemingly innocuous, gave rise to speculation about a possible romantic relationship between the two. For many, this idea was difficult to accept, But the seeds of suspicion had already been planted, and soon began to grow amidst the uncertainty surrounding the crime. When Detective James Alden began his investigation, Rachel was one of the names that inevitably came up on the list of suspects. During questioning, Rachel adamantly denied any kind of romantic relationship with Jared. She explained that their conversations were merely superficial, focusing on trivial topics such as music, movies, and reflections on life. According to her, Jared was simply looking for a willing ear, something she was willing to offer within appropriate limits. However, despite her denial, the defensive tone in her answers and the intensity with which she rejected the accusations left an ambiguous impression on the investigators. Was she really innocent? Or was she trying to hide something deeper? In addition to the rumors about her relationship with Jared, another detail caught the detective's attention: Rachel's alibi for the night of the murder. According to her statement, she had been making a personal phone call outside the camp during the estimated hours of the crime. Although her phone records confirmed activity during that period, they did not specify the exact location from which the call was made. This gap in the evidence left room for doubt. Had he actually been away from the camp as he claimed, or had he taken advantage of the darkness and silence to commit the crime before returning discreetly? The lack of witnesses who could verify his whereabouts added another layer of suspicion to his profile. Rachel's history within the camp also offered additional clues about her character and possible motivations. As administrator, she had full access to all areas of the site, including the cabin used for solitary punishment where Jared's body was found. In addition, her position of power allowed her to manipulate situations in her favor, something she had done in the past by implementing strict policies that some considered excessive. While there was no direct evidence linking Rachel to previous violent acts, her obsession with control and her willingness to clamp down when she felt her authority was being questioned made her a central figure in the investigation. Could she have seen Jared as a threat to her reputation or career? What if her conversations with him had revealed something compromising that needed to be silenced? After an exhaustive investigation, the case of the murder at Camp Horizon finally found its resolution thanks to a series of key clues that left no room for doubt. Among the most compelling findings was the forensic analysis conducted on the silver lighter found under the mattress in the cabin where Jared's body was discovered. DNA evidence collected from the surface of the lighter unequivocally linked monitor Robert Simmons to the crime scene. This discovery was a devastating blow to Robert's defense, who up to that point had tried to maintain a posture of innocence. But the evidence did not end there. Several additional interviews with other employees revealed troubling inconsistencies in Robert's initial account. Although he claimed to be supervising nighttime activities at the gym during the estimated time of the crime, 2 witnesses mentioned seeing him heading toward the cabins at suspicious times. These testimonies, coupled with the physical evidence, began to weave a net too tight for him to escape. Under the cumulative pressure of the investigations and the overwhelming weight of evidence, Robert finally relented. He confessed that he had accidentally struck Jared during a heated argument over allegations of abuse that the teenager planned to expose publicly. According to his account, he caught Jared as he was attempting to flee the camp, an act he interpreted as a direct threat to his authority and reputation. After a brief verbal confrontation, Robert lost control and struck him repeatedly with the flashlight he always carried with him. When Jared attempted to scream, Robert used a nylon rope, a common item in camp used to enforce discipline, to strangle him and silence him for good. The ensuing panic led him to make blunders. He tried to hide the body and feign suicide, but left numerous incriminating footprints in the process. The deliberate use of accessible items in the camp, such as the rope and the lamp, suggested some degree of premeditation in the crime. However, the lack of subsequent planning showed that Robert acted impulsively, dominated by fear and anger without preparing a convincing alibi. This case underscores how the combination of forensic evidence, behavioral analysis, and testimony can solve even the most complex crimes. Ultimately, Robert Simmons was sentenced to life in prison for aggravated manslaughter, closing a dark chapter in the history of Camp Horizon, but leaving indelible scars on all those who once trusted him. The trial of Robert Simmons was a tense and revealing process. Appearing in court, Robert maintained a stoic expression as forensic evidence and witness testimony confirmed his guilt. DNA analysis of the lighter, along with inconsistencies in his alibi, dismantled his initial version. Although he argued that the crime was accidental, the use of the rope and his attempted cover-up showed premeditation. Finally, the jury found him guilty of aggravated manslaughter. Sentenced to life in prison, Robert listened to the verdict in silence, as the victims' families and former campmates watched from the gallery, seeking justice and closure. Case 2. On a cold winter night, the quiet town of Lincoln, Nebraska was shaken by a brutal crime that left its inhabitants perplexed. 2 lifeless bodies were found in a room of the desolate Horizon Motel, located on the outskirts of town. The motel, known for its discretion and unconventional clientele, had witnessed countless stories silenced over the years. This time, however, the walls could not contain the horror of what happened inside that room. The murder scene was shocking. The victims, repeatedly stabbed with unusual viciousness, appeared to have been attacked without mercy. The room was in indescribable chaos. Furniture overturned, curtains torn, and bloodstains scattered everywhere. It was evident that a desperate struggle had been waged before death sealed the fate of both. The bodies lay in unnatural positions, as if they had tried to flee until the last moment. The scene conveyed a chilling sensation, as if the very air was permeated with violence and despair. News of the double murder spread quickly through the town, spreading fear among its inhabitants. Lincoln, a small community where everyone knew each other at least by sight, was not accustomed to this kind of tragedy. Neighbors, accustomed to the tranquility of their days, now looked over their shoulders with suspicion. Conversations in the streets revolved around what had happened, speculating about who might be capable of committing such an atrocity. Some spoke of a stranger seen lurking near the motel, while others mentioned old grudges and family secrets that might have come to light. The authorities, led by veteran detective Alan Brooks, were faced with a complex case from the beginning. The crime scene was littered with confusing clues and footprints pointing in multiple directions. Every corner of the room seemed to tell a different story, but none clear enough to reveal the truth. The forensic team worked hard to document every detail, knowing that even the smallest clue could be crucial to solving the case. However, the amount of information available was overwhelming, and separating the relevant from the irrelevant became a monumental challenge. Alan Brooks was a middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes that reflected decades of experience in criminal investigation. His reputation in the Lincoln Police Department was impeccable. He had solved some of the most complex cases in the region, always with a combination of meticulousness and empathy for the victims. Although he was known for his reserved nature, those who worked with him knew that he possessed an exceptional analytical mind and a unique ability to connect the darkest dots in any case. When he arrived at the Horizon Motel that night, Brooks knew immediately that this would be one of the most difficult cases of his career. The half-open door to room 17 opened onto a scene that looked like something out of a nightmare. Inside, the metallic smell of fresh blood permeated the air, and chaos reigned in every corner. Emma Carter, a 24-year-old woman, lay next to Michael Torres, a 30-year-old man, both surrounded by pools of congealed blood. Their clothes were torn and stained, and their bodies bore multiple stab wounds to the torso and neck. It was evident that the attack had been brutal and merciless. Brooks began his work calmly, observing every detail of the room before touching anything. He knew that the first impression was crucial, and that any mistake at this stage could compromise the entire investigation. As the forensic team took photographs and collected evidence, Brooks walked slowly around the bodies, analyzing the arrangement of overturned furniture and bloodstains. In his mind, a hypothesis was already beginning to form as to how the crime had occurred. "What does this tell us?" he muttered to himself as he examined a torn curtain hanging precariously on its rod. "Someone tried to escape but didn't make it." The detective called one of his assistants. "I want a detailed report on the fingerprints and DNA samples. Don't miss anything." Then, turning to the officer in charge of interviewing witnesses, he added, "Talk to the motel staff and anyone else who was here last night. We need to know who saw what and when." As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this was no ordinary crime. The victims were not strangers to each other. On the contrary, they had a close relationship that suggested that the murder had not been random. But what could have driven someone to commit such an act? The authorities began to delve into the lives of the victims, looking for connections, conflicts, or secrets that might explain what happened. What they discovered was a labyrinth of human emotions: betrayal, jealousy, forbidden loves, and long-held resentments. The victims' personal environment proved to be as complicated as the crime scene. Both had ties to people whose lives were also marked by tensions and contradictions. There were those who admired them, those who hated them and those who simply envied them. In a small town where personal relationships are deeply intertwined, any conflict can have unexpected repercussions. And in this case, those repercussions had culminated in a tragedy of devastating proportions. Solving the case would require more than just physical evidence. It would require unraveling a web of lies, manipulations, and hidden truths. Every testimony, every seemingly insignificant detail had to be carefully analyzed. The authorities knew that behind this crime was a much deeper story, a story that involved not only the victims, but also those around them. And although the road to the truth would be long and full of obstacles, there was no doubt that eventually it would be discovered who had crossed the line between hatred and violence. The people of Lincoln anxiously awaited the outcome of the investigation, aware that the resolution of the case would not only bring justice, but also an opportunity to understand how such a terrible thing could happen in their peaceful community. Meanwhile, Alan Brooks continued his tireless work, convinced that sooner or later the truth would come out. Michael Torres, a 30-year-old man, was known in the small town of Lincoln for his reserved nature and hard-working attitude. He worked as a mechanic in a local shop, where he earned a reputation for efficiency and reliability. Although not particularly sociable, those who knew him well remarked on his subtle sense of humor and his ability to solve complex problems calmly. Michael had grown up in a humble family, marked by the absence of his father from an early age, which led him to assume major responsibilities while still in his teens. His mother, a strong but overprotective woman, always encouraged him to seek stability. But Michael never managed to feel completely comfortable within the confines of a conventional life. In recent months, his life seemed to have taken a lighter turn thanks to his relationship with Emma Carter, although this also brought him some unexpected tensions. Emma Carter, 24, was a young woman whose presence lit up any room she occupied. As a receptionist at a dental clinic, she performed her job with a blend of professionalism and warmth that made even the most nervous patients feel welcome. Behind that friendly smile, however, Emma carried a personal history full of emotional ups and downs. She had been through volatile relationships in the past, some of which left deep marks on her self-esteem and confidence. Months before her death, Emma was involved in a case of workplace bullying, which created a tense atmosphere in her workplace and forced her to rethink her professional ties. Recently, her life seemed to have taken a positive turn when she began a relationship with Michael Torres, a man who was older than her, but with whom she shared common interests and dreams. This new stage aroused curiosity in her social circle, where some viewed the relationship with skepticism due to their age difference and personal backgrounds. However, Emma seemed determined to build something solid, something that would give her stability and happiness after so much time of uncertainty. The connection between Emma and Michael represented an attempt to put the chaos of their individual pasts behind them. But it was also clear that both carried with them emotional scars that may have influenced the decisions they made in the days leading up to their tragic fates. Their lives, so different but intertwined by a shared desire to reinvent themselves, are now part of a mystery that the people of Lincoln struggle to understand. Detective Alan Brooks enters the interrogation room with his characteristic calculated calm. His analytical mind is already weaving connections between clues and contradictions. With a track record for unraveling the most complex cases, his presence commands respect and tension. Every question he asks is like a move in a mental chess game, designed to disarm the suspect. Brooks is determined to get to the bottom of the truth. John Redd, a 35-year-old man, was a well-known figure in the small town of Lincoln, though not always for positive reasons. His imposing presence and volatile temperament made him stand out wherever he would be found. Known for his anger issues, John had spent much of his adult life battling inner demons that seemed to worsen with the passage of time. He was a man who carried with him a dangerous mix of vulnerability and aggression, traits that had led him to make mistakes that marked both his life and the lives of those around him. One of those mistakes was his relationship with Emma Carter, a young woman whose life was deeply affected by the 6 months they spent together. The relationship between John and Emma began like many others in town, with promises of love and plans for the future. However, it soon became apparent that John was unable to handle the emotional strains that inevitably arose in any romantic attachment. His emotional instability, exacerbated by excessive alcohol consumption, turned what could have been a genuine connection into a series of chaotic and, at times, violent episodes. The breakup came abruptly 6 months ago, when a particularly intense fight escalated to dangerous levels. That night, Screams echoed through the neighborhood, alerting neighbors who called the police. When authorities arrived, they found Emma crying and John furious, with visible signs of physical violence on both of them. He was arrested that night for domestic assault, an incident that left an indelible stain on his record and an emotional scar on Emma. Since then, John had tried to rebuild his life, though with little success. Despite his intermittent efforts to stay sober, he always returned to the same destructive pattern. He drank to forget, and his anger boiled over when emotions got the better of him. His friends, few and far between, knew he was not someone they could fully trust. At his core, John was a deeply wounded man, unable to adequately process rejection and loss. For him, the end of his relationship with Emma was not only the collapse of a romance, but also a public humiliation that fueled his resentment day after day. When authorities began investigating the double murder at the Horizon Motel, John quickly became a prime suspect. His history of violence and his direct connection to Emma placed him at the center of suspicion. When questioned, John claimed to be at a local bar drinking that night, an alibi that seemed designed to clear him of the crime. However, when investigators visited the establishment, none of the people present recalled seeing him there. Neither the waiter nor the regular customers could confirm his version, which left a significant gap in his account. This detail, added to his evasive behavior during the interrogation, increased the suspicions against him. John was a mosaic of contradictions. On the one hand, he could be charismatic and charming when he wanted to make a good impression. On the other, he was unpredictable and dangerous when he felt threatened or betrayed. Those who knew him well knew that he had an almost unhealthy obsession with Emma even after their breakup. He could not accept that she had moved on with her life, especially upon learning that she was dating Michael Torres. This new bond awakened in John a mixture of jealousy and anger that seemed to consume him completely. It was as if he saw Michael not only as a rival but as a direct threat to his pride and identity. Margaret Carter, a 58-year-old woman, was known in the small town of Lincoln for her strong character and traditional values. As a single mother who had raised Emma virtually on her own, Margaret had always strived to maintain a structured and disciplined household. Her life revolved around her daughter, whom she saw as an extension of herself, and she did not hesitate to intervene when she felt Emma's decisions were not in line with what she felt was right. Margaret was a conservative woman to the core, with entrenched views on how relationships, family roles, and social expectations should be. To her, the world was full of dangers and distractions that could lead people astray, and Emma, in her eyes, needed constant guidance to avoid making irreparable mistakes. The relationship between Margaret and Emma had always been complicated, marked by a mixture of unconditional love and constant tension. Margaret had a natural tendency to be overprotective, which often made Emma feel smothered. From a young age, Emma had learned to walk a fine line, to please her mother while trying to find space to explore her own identity. As Emma grew older, this dynamic became even more fraught, especially when she began to make choices that Margaret considered unwise or inappropriate. Emma's love choices were particularly problematic for Margaret, who had always hoped that her daughter would find someone safe, someone who shared her same values and could offer her a stable and predictable life. However, Emma seemed to be leaning toward more passionate and intense relationships, something Margaret could neither understand nor accept. When Emma began dating Michael Torres, an older man with a complicated past, Margaret saw this as a direct threat to everything she had tried to build for her daughter. From the beginning, she made it clear that she did not approve of the relationship. In her mind, Michael was a bad influence, someone whose presence in Emma's life would only bring trouble. Margaret feared that Emma was making a monumental mistake by getting involved with him, and she did not hesitate to voice these concerns on multiple occasions. During one particularly heated argument, Margaret went so far as to tell Emma that she would rather see her dead than with someone like Michael. These words, laden with frustration and despair, reflected the depth of her disapproval, but also hinted at a darkness in her character that many in town were unaware of. When authorities began investigating the brutal murder at the Horizon Motel, Margaret quickly came to attention as a possible person of interest. Her direct link to Emma, combined with her strong opposition to her relationship with Michael, placed her in an awkward position within the investigation. When questioned, Margaret claimed to have been at home watching television alone all night. According to her account, she had spent the hours prior to the crime engrossed in an old movie, not interacting with anyone or leaving her home. However, in the absence of witnesses who could confirm her alibi was called into question. Detectives knew that while a verbal statement might sound convincing, Lacking corroborating evidence raised reasonable doubts about its veracity. Margaret's temperament, though controlled in public, had more complex facets that few had witnessed. Those who knew her well knew that she was a woman who would not tolerate disagreement, especially when it came to her daughter. Her overprotectiveness often bordered on absolute control, and her inability to accept that Emma was no longer a child under her constant tutelage led her to overreact to any decision that did not match her expectations. This dynamic had created an emotional distance between the two, although Margaret continued to cling to the idea that her opinion was the only valid one. For her, Emma's welfare was above all else, even if it meant imposing her own ideas of happiness on her daughter. The relationship between Margaret and Emma was a maze of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, Margaret loved her daughter deeply and would do anything to protect her. On the other hand, her way of demonstrating that love was often oppressive and destructive. Margaret's obsession with controlling Emma's life had not only eroded their relationship, but had also created an atmosphere of constant tension in their home. Although she had never shown signs of physical violence, her language and attitude could be equally damaging. The words she had spoken during that previous argument with Emma now echoed in the investigators' minds as a chilling warning. Was it possible that Margaret had crossed an irrevocable line in her desperation to separate Emma from Michael? Ryan Kelly, a 32-year-old man, was a well-known figure in the small town of Lincoln, where his reputation preceded him. At first glance, Ryan appeared to be your typical charming ladies' man, someone who knew how to navigate social gatherings and capture the attention of those around him. He was outgoing, charismatic, and always ready to tell a good story or make others laugh with his witty remarks. However, beneath that facade of confidence and nonchalance, there was a more complex personality marked by an insatiable need for validation and control. Ryan not only enjoyed the attention he received from women, but also felt a deep frustration when this attention escaped him. This combination of self-centeredness and insecurity made him unpredictable in his reactions, especially when something or someone got in his way. As Michael Torres's best friend, Ryan had a close relationship with him. Although this friendship was far from perfect, the two shared common interests, from their love of sports to their tendency to frequent the same social circles. But Ryan also had a more competitive side that often pitted them indirectly against each other. This was particularly evident when Emma Carter came into the picture. From the moment Ryan met Emma, he felt an immediate attraction to her. Her beauty, intelligence, and independent nature fascinated him, and he quickly decided he wanted to win her over. However, Emma did not respond to his advances as he had hoped. On several occasions, Ryan tried to seduce her using his full arsenal of charm and flattery, but each time he was rebuffed. For someone who was used to getting what he wanted, these rejections were a severe blow to his ego. The situation worsened when Emma started dating Michael. Ryan saw this not only as a personal defeat, but also as a direct interference in his plans. In his mind, Michael had crossed a line by getting involved with Emma, someone Ryan considered home turf. This skewed perception of relationships and boundaries led him to blame Michael for his failure to win Emma over. According to some witnesses, Ryan had openly expressed his frustration on several occasions, even going so far as to threaten Michael days before the crime. These threats, while not specific or direct, hinted at a mixture of jealousy, resentment, and anger that troubled those who heard it. For Ryan, the relationship between Emma and Michael was not simply an emotional obstacle. It was a personal affront that needed to be corrected. When authorities began investigating the brutal murder at the Horizon Motel, Ryan quickly came to attention as a possible suspect. His bond with Michael, his obsession with Emma, and the threats he had made placed him in an awkward position in the investigation. When questioned, Ryan claimed to have been playing poker with friends at a nearby house on the night of the crime. According to his account, he had spent several hours enjoying a quiet game with a group of regular companions, which seemed to provide him with a solid alibi. However, when investigators dug deeper into the testimonies of the other players, inconsistencies emerged that complicated his account. One of the participants partially confirmed his presence, but admitted that Ryan had disappeared for approximately 30 minutes without providing clear explanations as to his whereabouts. This temporary gap in his alibi raised significant doubts about his version of events. Ryan's behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime also raised suspicions. Those who knew him well noticed a change in his attitude, a tension that was not usually present in his usual easygoing manner. There were times when he seemed distracted, as if he was thinking about something more important than the conversation or activity he was engaged in. In addition, some friends mentioned seeing him argue with Michael on one occasion, although they were unable to hear the exact details of the conversation. These fragments of information, though small, painted a picture of a man who was dealing with intense and possibly dangerous emotions. The combination of his obsession with Emma, his resentment toward Michael, and his lack of a solid alibi made him a central figure in the investigation. Sarah Lewis, a 26-year-old woman, was a familiar figure at the dental clinic where she worked as a receptionist alongside Emma Carter. From the first day Emma arrived on the scene, Sarah felt threatened by her presence. It wasn't just that Emma was friendly, professional, and efficient at her job. What really bothered Sarah was how she quickly gained the respect and admiration of both patients and management. While Emma received constant praise and positive evaluations, Sarah struggled to keep up, always feeling overshadowed by her colleague. This work dynamic created a silent but palpable rivalry between them, a conflict that Sarah carried resentfully within herself. Their competitiveness was not only professional, it was also personal, fueled by a mixture of jealousy and frustration that gradually morphed into something darker. Sarah had a reputation at work for being difficult to deal with. She was known for her impulsive nature and her tendency to challenge the rules when they did not coincide with her interests. Her colleagues learned to handle her with care, knowing that any criticism or comment could trigger a defensive reaction. Although she tried to project an image of confidence and self-sufficiency, those who knew her well could see behind that facade. Sarah was deeply insecure and relied on external validation to feel satisfied with herself. When Emma entered the clinic, that insecurity was exacerbated. Watching her partner excel with no apparent effort awakened in Sarah a slowly consuming mixture of envy and hatred. In her mind, Emma's every success was a personal defeat, and every recognition from management was a direct affront to her pride. The situation escalated to critical levels when Sarah was temporarily suspended for insubordination. According to her, this punishment was unfair and, worse, unnecessary. In her version of events, Emma had been the one to report her to management, falsely accusing her of inappropriate behavior. Although there was no conclusive evidence to confirm this theory, Sarah was convinced that Emma had played a key role in her suspension. This incident marked a turning point in their relationship, transforming latent resentment into open and avowed hatred. Sarah did not hesitate to publicly express her animosity towards Emma, making her emotions clear in scathing comments and hostile attitudes. To those who worked with them, it was evident that the tension between the two had reached a dangerous level. When authorities began investigating the brutal murder at the Horizon Motel, Sarah quickly came to their attention as a possible suspect. Her work relationship with Emma, her overt resentment, and the public accusations she had made against her placed her in an awkward position in the investigation. When questioned, Sarah claimed to be on a romantic date at a downtown restaurant on the night of the crime. According to her version, she had spent several hours dining with her partner, which seemed to provide her with a solid alibi. However, when investigators delved into the details, inconsistencies emerged that complicated her account. His partner corroborated his presence at the restaurant, but both admitted to arriving late and barely interacting with other patrons. This gap in her alibi raised significant doubts about her version of events. Sarah's behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime also raised suspicions. Those who knew her well noticed a change in her attitude, an intensity that was not usually present in her usual defensiveness. There were times when she seemed distracted, as if she were obsessed with something more important than work or everyday conversations. In addition, some colleagues mentioned hearing her make hurtful comments about Emma in hushed tones, although they never managed to understand the full context. These snippets of information, though small, painted a picture of a woman who was dealing with intense and possibly dangerous emotions. The combination of her stated hatred of Emma, her recent job suspension, and her lack of a solid alibi made her a central figure in the investigation. After days of intensive questioning and meticulous forensic analysis, the case took an unexpected turn when Detective Alan Brooks noticed an anomaly in the fingerprints found on the motel room window. These matched those of John Redd, who had initially adamantly denied ever having been at the crime scene. During the initial interrogations, John was evasive, even defiant, claiming he had nothing to do with what happened. However, as the evidence began to accumulate and the contradictions in his testimony became apparent, the pressure on him increased considerably. Finally, under a combination of irrefutable evidence and the relentless insistence of Detective Brooks, John collapsed emotionally and confessed to being the perpetrator of the brutal murder. According to his testimony, he had followed Emma to the Horizon Motel after learning that she would be spending the night with Michael Torres. Consumed by jealousy and uncontrollable rage, he decided to confront them. He had a kitchen knife with him that he had brought from home, a detail that suggested a certain premeditation in his actions. Bursting into the room, he attacked the victims mercilessly, stabbing them repeatedly in a frenzied attack that reflected his emotional imbalance. In his post-crime confusion, he left the bloody weapon in the sink before fleeing the scene, possibly unaware of the number of clues he was leaving behind. The investigation also revealed that some items found at the crime scene, such as the crumpled note in Emma's pocket, turned out to be irrelevant to the case. The note previously written was simply a letter of apology addressed to a friend, an attempt by Emma to close a personal chapter that had nothing to do with the events that led to her death. However, other details, such as the broken watch found on the floor, provided a crucial timeline. The clock's hands pointed to 11:47 p.m., corroborating the estimated time of the crime according to forensic reports and collected testimony. The murder was committed with a swift but disorganized technique, indicating that John acted out of emotion rather than a meticulous plan. Although he had the knife with him, his manner of attack showed a lack of precision and control. The wounds inflicted on the victims suggested that both had desperately tried to defend themselves, but John's physical advantage, combined with his blind rage, prevented them from escaping. Overturned furniture and torn curtains were evidence of the struggle before life left their bodies. The key to solving the case was the combination of physical and psychological evidence. Fingerprints found on the window were decisive in linking John to the crime scene, while contradictions in his statement exposed his nervousness and lack of a solid alibi. Ultimately, John Red was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, closing one of the most shocking cases in the history of the town of Lincoln. The verdict brought a degree of peace to the community, but also left deep scars on those who knew Emma and Michael. For many, this tragic episode served as a chilling reminder of how human emotions, when run wild, can have devastating consequences. The people of Lincoln, accustomed to the tranquility and security of their days, would never forget this case. The resolution of the crime not only meant justice for the victims, but also an opportunity to reflect on the complexities of human relationships and the dangers that lurk when hatred and jealousy take over. Case 3. The night was dense, shrouded in a haze that seemed to hide secrets beneath its grayish cloak. In the heart of a quiet and somewhat neglected neighborhood, where street lamps flickered intermittently and the gardens were overgrown with unruly weeds, stood a small convenience store almost invisible to those who did not know it. It was one of those places that seemed out of time, the exterior walls worn from years of rain and sun, and a rusty bell that rang every time someone entered or left. For many, it was simply a place to buy snacks, refreshments, and basic items. But that night, this unassuming store became the scene of a crime so brutal that no one would ever forget. Inside the back warehouse, the air was heavy with an eerie silence, broken only by the monotonous hum of a bare light bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. The warehouse, which usually served as a functional space to store inventory, now looked like the perfect backdrop for a nightmare. In the midst of that ominous chaos lay the body. It was face up, surrounded by a pool of blood that was slowly spreading across the cracked concrete floor. The victim was wearing a white t-shirt that had once been clean, but was now soaked in dark crimson. His hands still showed signs of having tried to stop the deadly bleeding, fingers twitching as if they had fought the inevitable until the last moment. Her eyes remained open, fixed on some undefined point beyond the ceiling, while her face retained an expression of absolute terror, as if she had confronted death itself face to face. A few inches from the body, a jagged piece of sharp glass rested innocently, albeit covered with blurred fingerprints and remnants of human tissue. It appeared to have been used without mercy, as if the wielder had no intention of showing mercy. All around, everything suggested that the fight had been brief but violent. A rusty screwdriver lay nearby, next to a half-empty bottle of alcohol, both objects curiously out of place in that macabre scene. Had they been used as tools of intimidation? Or perhaps they were part of a daily routine abruptly interrupted by something much darker. That's when Detective Rowan Ashcroft arrived, a tall, thin man whose face always seemed to be carved in stone. With his black trench coat billowing behind him, Rowan had a reputation for solving impossible cases, thanks to his meticulousness and ability to read between the lines. His piercing gaze swept over the scene with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. It didn't take him more than a few seconds to realize that this was not a simple robbery or a random act of violence. There was too much anger contained in every detail, from the position of the body to the state of the scattered objects. "This isn't just a murder," he muttered to himself as he crouched next to the corpse. "It's personal." The detective noticed at once that the back door of the warehouse was ajar, letting in a cold draft that made the dim light bulb shiver. The marks on the floor indicated that someone had fled in haste, but who and why? As he examined the blood-stained notebook found among the boxes, his brows furrowed. The torn pages contained hurried writings, keywords scrawled with urgency, dates, truncated names, and references to clandestine meetings. Each line seemed to be a fragment of a larger puzzle, one that Rowan knew he would have to piece together piece by piece. Meanwhile, outside, a small group of curious onlookers began to gather, attracted by the blue and red lights of the police vehicles illuminating the street. Nervous whispers filled the air, speculation about who the victim might be and what exactly had happened. But inside the warehouse, time seemed to have stopped. There was only the echo of horror and the implicit promise that sooner or later the whole truth would come out. Rowan stood up and pulled out his notebook. He knew this case would be different. Too many loose threads, too many intertwined emotions. What he didn't yet know was that it would lead him straight to the heart of a web of secrets and betrayals that would change his perspective forever. Jared Wren was 28 years old and a seemingly ordinary young man, but his story was full of nuances that made him unique. He was an only child, a detail that always weighed more heavily on him than he let on. His parents lived in another town, a small rural community where opportunities were as scarce as money. Because of this, Jared had learned to fend for himself from an early age. He kept in sporadic contact with them, although calls had become less and less frequent due to the financial problems they both faced. Jared never talked about his family life. He simply smiled when anyone asked, as if to shield them from the judgment of others. He had worked for 2 years at the local convenience store, a job that many considered routine but which for him meant stability. His dedication did not go unnoticed by his co-workers or Silas Thorne, the store manager. Jared was known for being friendly and hard-working, always willing to help when someone needed to cover a shift or solve an unexpected problem. Lately, however, some co-workers noticed that he seemed distracted, as if something was consuming him internally. There were times when they would see him anxiously looking at his phone or pacing back and forth during breaks, absorbed in his thoughts. What no one knew was that Jared was leading a double life. Although he projected an image of normalcy at work, detectives discovered he had secrets he jealously guarded. His phone revealed messages filled with loving words and clandestine plans, details that suggested Jared was involved in a complicated relationship. This hidden facet of his personality contrasted profoundly with the public image he displayed on a daily basis. It was as if Jared had built an invisible barrier between his outer world and his innermost emotions. Despite everything, those who knew him well said that Jared had a kind heart, able to listen without judgment and to offer help without expecting anything in return. Perhaps it was that same kindness that led him to make decisions that eventually placed him in danger. The truth is that behind his quiet smile and reserved demeanor, Jared Wren carried with him a weight that no one could have imagined until it was too late. Detective Rowan Ashcroft knew that every word, every gesture, and every detail could be crucial to unraveling the truth. With fragmented evidence and multiple suspects, it was time to dig deeper into the testimonies. Interrogations would not only reveal alibis, but also hidden emotions and buried truths. Each person involved held a piece of the puzzle, and Ashcroft was determined to connect them all, no matter how much pain or secrets came to light in the process. Silas Thorne was a man who, at first glance, appeared to be the epitome of discretion and efficiency. At 35 years old, he had been working for more than a decade in the small convenience store that had now become the epicenter of a tragedy. His life revolved around that place, every shelf organized with surgical precision, every inventory checked with absolute meticulousness, reflected his obsessive and controlling nature. Silas had no criminal record or history of legal problems, but those who knew him well knew that behind that orderly facade was someone who could become possessive when he felt that something or someone was beyond his control. Although he was not a tall man, his presence commanded respect. His dark hair was always slicked back with gel, and his gray eyes had an intensity that made many employees look down when he looked at them. He was quiet, reserved, and preferred to act rather than talk a lot. Yet this same restrained quiet often hinted at a volatile temper that few had seen fully unleashed. Some employees commented quietly that Silas tended to keep too close an eye on those who worked under him, especially Jared Wren, who had been found dead in the back warehouse. Although Jared was one of the most trusted employees, Silas never seemed to relax completely with him. There was something in his demeanor that suggested distrust, as if he knew something the others were unaware of. When Detective Rowan Ashcroft arrived at the crime scene, it was inevitable that Silas would become one of the main focuses of attention. Dressed in his usual uniform, an immaculate white shirt and black pants, Silas looked out of place among the chaos in the warehouse. His hands were shaking slightly as he tried to explain what had happened, though his tone remained steady and restrained. According to him, he had been at home watching television with his wife Evelyn during the estimated time of the murder. There was no one else there to back up his version, as they lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The lack of witnesses began to raise suspicions almost immediately. The interrogation with Detective Ashcroft was revealing, though not for what Silas said, but for what he omitted. As he spoke, his eyes avoided meeting the investigators directly, as if he feared the investigator could read his deepest thoughts. He explained that he had decided to leave the store early that night because he wanted to check some outstanding inventory before closing. He said that he hadn't noticed anything strange when he arrived, and that he only discovered the body when he went into the back store to make sure everything was in order. However, there were inconsistencies in his account. For example, he mentioned turning off all the lights when he left, but investigators found the storage room light bulb still on. Also, the back door was ajar, something Silas claimed he did not remember leaving open. What struck Ashcroft most was how Silas spoke about Jared. Although he tried to maintain a neutral expression, his words revealed a mixture of frustration and barely concealed resentment. He described Jared as a good employee, but quickly added that he seemed distracted lately. This ambivalence in his tone prompted the detective to delve deeper into the relationship between the two. Conversations with other employees confirmed that Silas tended to be protective of his team, but also extremely critical if someone did not meet his expectations. It seemed clear that Jared had crossed some invisible line that Silas was not willing to tolerate. Silas's emotional and psychological context slowly began to take shape. He was a man trapped in his own self-imposed rules, unable to accept anything that threatened his sense of order. If Jared posed a threat to that structure, whether real or perceived, it wasn't hard to imagine how Silas might have reacted. His alibi, while plausible, lacked external verification, and the contradictory details in his testimony made his version less and less credible. To Detective Ashcroft, Silas Thorne was not just a possible witness to the crime. He was a man whose life seemed built on secrets, and those secrets might hold the key to solving the mystery of the dark warehouse. Evelyn Thorne, wife of Silas. She was 32 years old and a woman whose presence always seemed to be shrouded in a kind of emotional haze. At first glance, she could pass for quiet and reserved, but those who knew her well knew that Evelyn carried an invisible weight with her, one she was not always willing to share. She had no criminal record or history of legal problems, but her personal life was marked by emotional scars that had left their mark on her character. Close friends revealed that Evelyn had faced bouts of depression in the past, times when she seemed to disconnect from the world and retreat into an unfathomable silence. This vulnerable side of her personality made it difficult to read her completely. It was as if she wore several masks, changing them according to the situation. Despite her emotional fragility, Evelyn always tried to project an image of normalcy. She was the foster mother of a small dog, whom she cared for with almost obsessive devotion, and she spent long hours tidying up the garden of her house, a small oasis of flowers and plants that contrasted with the desolation of the neighborhood. Yet that garden also seemed to be a form of escapism. Digging in the dirt, pruning the leaves, or simply watching the flowers grow gave her a sense of control that she rarely found in other areas of her life. She was a woman constantly fighting against unseen currents, even if only she knew exactly what it was she was trying to keep at bay. When Detective Rowan Ashcroft began investigating the crime, Evelyn quickly became a central character on the board. Her connection to Jared Wren, the victim, was discovered thanks to text messages recovered from the latter's phone. The conversations revealed an intimate and secret relationship, full of loving words and clandestine plans. When confronted with this evidence, Evelyn initially denied everything, but her face visibly paled when Ashcroft mentioned specific details of the messages. Finally, under pressure, she admitted that she had had an affair with Jared, although she claimed it had ended weeks before the murder. According to her, the relationship had been an impulsive mistake that she deeply regretted. During questioning, Evelyn claimed to be home alone while Silas, her husband, went to the store to check on some outstanding inventory. She explained that she had gone out to the backyard to pick up gardening tools shortly after hearing a strange noise coming from the direction of the store. Although her version seemed plausible, a neighbor claimed to have seen her run out to the store shortly after hearing screams coming from the location. This discrepancy raised suspicions about her alibi. Had she really gone to the yard, or had she been closer to the store than she claimed? The neighbor's testimony added a layer of uncertainty to her account, leaving open the possibility that Evelyn was somehow involved. Evelyn's potential motive was complex and emotionally nuanced. While it was less likely that she had committed the crime on her own initiative, there were valid reasons to consider her a suspect. One possibility was that she feared Jared would expose her relationship with Silas, something that would have destroyed her marriage and her already precarious emotional stability. Another hypothesis suggested that she might have acted under extreme emotional pressure, especially if she felt that Jared was blackmailing or manipulating her. These types of situations were common in clandestine relationships, where the power between the parties could shift quickly. Perhaps Evelyn had reached a breaking point, unable to handle the tension that had built up over months. What struck Detective Ashcroft most was Evelyn's palpable vulnerability during the interrogation. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of coffee, and her eyes filled with tears every time she mentioned Jared's name. There was something genuinely sad in her gaze, as if she was already paying a heavy emotional price for what she had done. Yet that same vulnerability also raised difficult questions. Was it possible that Evelyn had acted in a moment of desperation, without thinking of the consequences? Or was she feigning remorse to deflect suspicion? Evelyn's emotional context was crucial to understanding her role in the case. Living under Silas's possessive control should not have been easy. He was a man who demanded perfection and absolute obedience, and any deviation from his expectations was cause for conflict. For Evelyn, the relationship with Jared could have been both a form of escape and an additional source of stress. In her mind, she may have seen in Jared an opportunity to find freedom, but that very pursuit of freedom led her straight to the edge of a cliff. As Ashcroft delved deeper into the investigation, it became clear that Evelyn was no mere bystander in this drama. Her actions, decisions, and intertwined emotions were part of a much larger puzzle. While there was no hard evidence linking her directly to the murder, her behavior and history left room for doubt. Evelyn Thorne was a woman caught between two worlds, struggling to survive in a stifling marriage while navigating the consequences of a forbidden relationship. And while her guilt was not yet proven, her presence in the case was undeniably significant. Jasper Cole was 24 years old, and a young man who at first glance appeared to be the epitome of youthful insouciance. He worked as a convenience store clerk, a job he took more out of financial necessity than personal calling. Although not known for being especially responsible or meticulous, Jasper had an energy that made him stand out among his peers. He was quick to make jokes, always with a wry smile on his face, and he tended to move with a relaxed attitude that contrasted with the somewhat tense atmosphere that Silas Thorne imposed on the place. However, beneath that facade of tranquility, there was a darker, more volatile side that few fully understood. Jasper had a minor history of street fights, incidents that occurred during his teenage years and never escalated to anything more serious. Although these episodes were behind him, they left a mark on his reputation. Some saw him as someone who could lose control if he felt provoked, while others simply considered him an impulsive young man still searching for his place in the world. Close friends said Jasper was loyal to a fault, but also extremely territorial when he felt someone was invading his emotional or workspace. This duality made him a complex figure within the store's small ecosystem. In the weeks leading up to the crime, several employees noted that Jasper and Jared had argued on several occasions. The tensions arose primarily over work-related differences. According to some witnesses, Jasper felt that Jared received preferential treatment from Silas, something that deeply irritated him. For Jasper, who worked part-time and struggled to maintain a balance between his personal and professional life, this perceived unfairness was hard to ignore. The arguments were intense but brief, leaving a trace of discomfort in the air each time they occurred. However, no one imagined that these disputes could have such serious consequences. Further complicating Jasper's role in the investigation was the possibility that he knew about the secret relationship between Jared and Evelyn Thorne. Although there was no hard evidence of this, some rumors suggested that Jasper had hinted, in casual conversations, that he suspected something about Jared. While he did not explicitly mention a romantic affair, his behavior toward Jared changed markedly in the days leading up to the murder. He appeared more distant, almost as if he was harboring some sort of resentment. This led Detective Rowan Ashcroft to wonder if Jasper might have acted impulsively, driven by jealousy, anger, or even a misguided sense of justice. When the detective questioned Jasper, he claimed to be at home playing video games during the estimated time of the crime. His alibi seemed solid at first, as his parents confirmed that he had been there all night. However, when asked specifically about the exact time of the murder, both admitted they could not pinpoint it with certainty. They had been watching television in another room, and were not paying attention to what Jasper was doing. This gap in their testimony left room for doubt. Had Jasper left without his parents noticing? Or had he crept back so quietly that no one saw him? During the interrogation, Jasper maintained a relaxed, even somewhat arrogant attitude, as if trying to convince the detective that he had nothing to do with the crime. However, there were moments when his mask of indifference cracked. His hands shook slightly when asked directly about his relationship with Jared, and he avoided looking the detective in the eye when discussing the most recent argument between the two. These small details caused Ashcroft to dig deeper into her story, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal something else. Jasper's emotional context was crucial to understanding his possible involvement in the case. He was a young man living in a constant tug-of-war between wanting to fit in and feeling marginalized. His relationship with Jared represented a mixture of rivalry and resentment, while his loyalty to Silas added another layer of complexity. If Jasper had discovered the truth about Jared and Evelyn's relationship, he may have felt that his work, world one of the few places where he found structure, was being threatened. In that case, his impulsive reaction might have resulted in an act of violence that he never fully planned. As Ashcroft progressed through the investigation, it became clear that Jasper was more than just a witness. His impulsive nature, history of conflict, and possible knowledge of Jared's secrets placed him in an uncomfortable position within the case. Although there was no conclusive evidence linking him directly to the murder, his presence in the puzzle was undeniable. Jasper Cole was a young man caught between his own emotions and decisions, and although his guilt was not yet proven, his role in the drama could not be ignored. After an exhaustive investigation involving weeks of forensic analysis, interrogations, and reconstruction of events, detectives finally turned their attention to Silas Thorne. Several key pieces of evidence converged to point to him as the prime suspect, and this evidence left no doubt as to his guilt. The fingerprints found on the piece of glass used as a murder weapon matched Silas's perfectly, a detail that sealed his fate by connecting him directly to the crime. But it was Evelyn's statement that finally crumbled any attempt at denial on Silas's part. Under pressure during cross-examination, Evelyn admitted that Silas returned home that night, visibly agitated and with red stains on his clothes, after changing his clothes back to the store. Although she initially tried to protect him, Evelyn finally gave in to the emotional pressure and revealed what she had witnessed. Silas, faced with such overwhelming evidence, could no longer sustain his alibi. Finally, he confessed to the crime, although he tried to justify it as an impulsive act born out of anger and betrayal. According to his testimony, he had discovered evidence of the relationship between Jared and Evelyn through text messages he found on his wife's phone. Consumed with jealousy and rage, he decided to confront Jared in the back storage room of the store. What began as a heated argument quickly escalated to uncontrollable levels when Silas lost control. In a fit of violence, he grabbed a sharp piece of broken glass from a store window and used it to attack Jared. The act was brutal and vicious, a reflection of the emotional storm Silas was experiencing at the time. The murder was committed using an improvised object, suggesting that it had not been planned in advance. The piece of glass, jagged and sharp, had probably been in the warehouse for days, the product of some previous damage to one of the windows. Silas, knowing the place like the back of his hand, knew exactly where to find it and how to use it to his advantage. After the attack, he took advantage of his familiarity with the surroundings to escape quickly, leaving Jared's body lying in a pool of blood. His intention was clear. He wanted to distance himself from the crime scene as soon as possible, even though he knew the evidence would eventually link him. During the trial, Silas's lawyers tried to argue that he acted under extreme provocation, suggesting that anyone in his situation might have reacted similarly. However, the jury was not convinced by this defense. Although the crime was impulsive, the brutality of the act and the premeditation implicit in the use of the glass as a weapon were decisive factors in the final verdict. Silas was found guilty of first-degree murder, a verdict that reflected the seriousness of his actions. The case left a deep mark on everyone involved. For Evelyn, Silas's betrayal was a bitter reminder of how possessiveness and control can lead to devastating consequences. For the store employees, the crime served as a warning about the dangers of secrets and toxic relationships. And for Silas, who was now facing a lengthy prison sentence, the impulsive act that led him to commit murder would be a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. A life that, ironically, he had tried so hard to control, but which ended up completely shattered by his own hand. Case 4. The night at Oakville Municipal Stadium was charged with an eerie, almost unreal atmosphere. The venue, an icon revered for its long history in amateur and professional baseball, seemed to have lost its soul that rainy day. Gray clouds hovered over the stadium's metal roof, while the drizzle fell insistently, creating small puddles in the empty stands. It was the kind of scenario that invited melancholy, but that night, also horror. It was there, in the home team's dugout, that the lifeless body of Caleb Hawthorne was discovered, lying face up on the cold concrete floor. Just hours earlier, that same space had been a hive of youthful energy, laughter and cheers. Now only a stony silence remained. Caleb's corpse was surrounded by objects strewn about as if there had been a chaotic battle. Broken helmets, scattered wooden bats, and gloves left in odd positions. He was wearing his usual uniform, a white t-shirt with the team logo embroidered in blue, gray pants and training boots that once shone with pride. Now, however, his clothes were stained with blood, and his face showed an expression that would freeze anyone's blood. A mixture of surprise, pain, and something deeper, perhaps even betrayal. In his right hand, still clenched in a rigid fist, was a silver whistle, one of the most iconic accessories of his coaching career. That object, so simple and familiar, seemed to mock the tragedy that had just occurred. Near the body, a bloody aluminum bat lay a few feet away, abandoned in a position that suggested someone had dropped it in a hurry. Traces of fresh mud led toward the back exit of the stadium, as if someone had fled in a hurry in the rain. Shards of broken glass near a side window indicated that this could have been the killer's entry or escape route. The whole place breathed disorder and urgency, as if the crime had been committed in the midst of an emotional storm, both internally and externally. The air smelled musty and metallic, and every step inside the stadium echoed with an echo that made it difficult to ignore the magnitude of what had happened. Detective Ethan Graves arrived on the scene shortly after 11 p.m., when the forensic team had already begun their painstaking work. Graves was known in the city for his keen instincts and his ability to piece together stories from the most insignificant details. With his rain-soaked black trench coat and thoughtful expression, he paused in front of Caleb's body, observing it with a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. To him, every crime scene was like a puzzle, and this one would be no exception. As his eyes scanned the scene, he noticed how the flickering light from the emergency lamps briefly illuminated key objects: the bloody bat, the muddy footprints, the shards of glass. Everything seemed to tell a story, but important pieces were still missing to complete the picture. The atmosphere in the stadium was oppressive, as if the walls themselves knew that something irreparable had happened there. The constant sound of raindrops hitting against the metal roof added an almost palpable layer of tension. Every corner of the place seemed to hold secrets, and Graves knew he had to move carefully. He couldn't afford to overlook even the smallest detail. His mind was already at work, connecting visual clues with preliminary hypotheses. What had brought Caleb to the stadium that night? Why would someone want to attack him in such a public yet lonely place? The questions were piling up, but for now he had only cold, unmoving certainties. A lifeless body, a bloody bat, and a silver whistle that seemed a mute witness to the tragedy. As forensic technicians took photographs and collected samples, Graves allowed himself a moment to reflect on the irony of the situation. A place that for decades had been synonymous with passion, sport, and community had now become the scene of a violent death. The image of Caleb, a man who had dedicated his life to training young people and teaching them values, lay motionless on the ground, the victim of a brutal act. It was a cruel reminder of how fragile life can be, even in the safest of places. And though he still had no answers, Graves knew this case would not be easy. Something about the scene told him that what had happened that night went beyond a simple impulsive crime. There was history here, resentments and perhaps buried secrets that someone had tried to silence forever. Caleb Jonathan Hawthorne, 47, was a respected and admired figure in the Oakville sports community. As head coach of the Oakville Lions youth baseball team, he had devoted much of his life to molding young talent, instilling in them not only athletic skills, but also core values such as teamwork, perseverance, and discipline. His decade-long career as a professional player had made him a benchmark in local baseball, but it was his decision to retire due to a knee injury that marked the beginning of a new stage in his life, that of a mentor. Since then, Caleb has devoted himself completely to the training of children and adolescents, guiding them with firmness and wisdom. However, behind that public image of kindness and fairness, Caleb had a reputation for being demanding and strict in private. His training methods were rigorous, and his decisions, while always well-intentioned, were not always popular. In recent weeks, this harsher side of his personality had begun to generate significant tensions. Some parents of players had expressed their displeasure, especially after certain controversial decisions about who should make the starting lineup. These disputes not only sowed resentment among some members of the community, but also fueled rumors that Caleb had received anonymous threats in the days leading up to his tragic death. Although he never officially reported these incidents, those who knew him well noted that he seemed more troubled than usual in recent weeks. Caleb's paradox was that while many saw him as an indispensable pillar for the development of young athletes, others perceived him as an authoritarian figure whose rigidity could be uncomfortable or even unfair. This duality in his character left a complicated legacy, filled with both admiration and criticism. Now, with his life so violently cut short, the community faced the difficult task of reconciling these two sides of Caleb, trying to understand what could have driven someone to commit such a brutal act against a man who, for many, represented the very heart of baseball in Oakville. Detective Ethan Graves, known for his meticulousness and astuteness, knew that every detail at the crime scene pointed to a complex puzzle. With the first clues analyzed and the main suspects identified, it was time to dig deeper into the testimonies. Convinced that the truth was hidden behind the words and emotions of those around Caleb Hawthorne, Graves prepared his notebook and recorder, ready to unravel secrets and contradictions in the interrogations that were about to begin. Roderick Monroe, a 52-year-old man with a commanding presence and a history tied to baseball, was one of the names that resonated in the small world of Oakville. A former professional player in his younger years, Roderick had been known for his prowess on the field and his ability to lead his team to victory. However, his career was cut short prematurely due to a shoulder injury that forced him to retire early. Since then, Roderick had found a new vocation as the owner of a sporting goods store in downtown Oakville. His business, though modest, was a gathering place for sports fans, where conversations about strategies, players, and games were never lacking. Despite his initial success, in recent years, Roderick had faced financial difficulties that threatened to bring him to the brink of collapse. Rumors suggested that accumulated debts and failed investments had put considerable pressure on him, something that many in the community were unaware of. The relationship between Roderick and Caleb Hawthorne had always been complex, marked by a mixture of mutual admiration and latent rivalry. The two shared glorious moments in the past, when they both played on professional teams and competed side by side on the fields. Over time, that connection evolved into a close, if not tension-free, friendship. 6 months ago, however, that relationship took a drastic turn. Caleb, who now held the prestigious position of head coach of the Oakville Lions youth team, declined to offer Roderick an assistant coaching position. According to witnesses, this decision sparked a public argument that left a lasting impression on the memories of those who were present. Roderick, visibly furious, raised his voice to be heard throughout the stadium, angrily proclaiming, "You'll regret this, Caleb." Before leaving, he left behind him an atmosphere charged with resentment and implicit promises of revenge. That episode stuck in the community's mind, quickly becoming a possible lead for investigators. As the investigation progressed, Roderick's name emerged as one of the main suspects. Not only was his behavior during that argument suspicious, but also his precarious financial situation. The financial difficulties he was facing could have been a powerful motive for seeking revenge against Caleb, or even trying to blackmail him by taking advantage of his position as a trainer. In addition, the fact that Roderick knew the stadium well and had regular access to the site increased the suspicions against him. However, when questioned, Roderick flatly denied any involvement in the crime. According to his version, on the night of the murder, he was at home watching television with his wife, Marlene Monroe, who confirmed his testimony. Although Marlene seemed sincere in her statement, investigators noted some hesitation in her tone, as if she was trying too hard to back up her husband's alibi. Without conclusive physical evidence linking Roderick to the crime scene, authorities found themselves at a dead end. Roderick's character was another element that complicated the investigation. He was a passionate man, with an intense personality that could become volatile under pressure. Those who knew him well described an individual who rarely held grudges, but when he did, he was capable of acting on extreme emotions. During his youth, Roderick had been notorious for his explosive temper on the playing fields, something that over the years he had learned to control, though not completely. This dark side of his personality piqued the curiosity of the investigators, who began to wonder whether this old resentment towards Caleb might have resurfaced with a vengeance in a moment of economic desperation. Was it possible that Roderick, beset by debt and frustrated by his friend's rejection, had decided to take drastic measures? However, despite suspicions, the lack of physical evidence left many questions unanswered. Muddy footprints found at the crime scene did not match Roderick's shoes, and forensic analysis failed to establish a direct connection between him and the bloody bat left next to Caleb's body. Still, investigators did not completely rule out his involvement. The broken side window and footprints leading to the back exit of the stadium remained key clues, but none of them pointed directly to Roderick. Marlene's testimony, while compelling, was not enough to completely exonerate him. Ultimately, Roderick Monroe remained a mystery in the case. A man whose life intertwined with Caleb Hawthorne's made him a central figure in the search for the truth. Priscilla Rivers, a 41-year-old woman with a strong and determined presence, was known in Oakville as an extremely protective and devoted mother. Her life revolved around her two sons, Lucas, a talented young man who played as a starter on the Oakville Lions youth baseball team, and her youngest daughter, a dedicated student attending a local elementary school. Priscilla had always been an active figure in the school and sports community, participating in parent meetings, school events, and baseball games. However, her devotion to her children, while admirable in many ways, also revealed a more intense and, at times, conflicted side. It was evident that Priscilla would not tolerate what she perceived as injustices to her family, especially when it came to her son, Lucas. The relationship between Priscilla and Caleb had been strained from the beginning. Priscilla strongly believed that Caleb unfairly favored other players over Lucas, something she considered a direct affront to her son's abilities and efforts. According to close sources, this perception had led to multiple verbal confrontations between the two. Priscilla did not hesitate to express her displeasure openly, accusing Caleb of ruining Lucas's chances and thus his future as a professional player. On several occasions, according to witnesses, Priscilla had lost her composure during these discussions, leaving behind words laden with anger and resentment. Some even recalled how she went so far as to verbally threaten Caleb, saying she would pay for ruining my son's future. These statements, while not taken seriously at the time, now took on significant weight in the context of the investigation. In addition to her confrontational behavior, investigators discovered a troubling fact in Priscilla's background. She had a criminal record for domestic assault. This fact added a layer of complexity to her profile, suggesting that she had a tendency to act impulsively when she felt threatened or betrayed. Although the exact details of that incident were not widely known, it was clear that Priscilla had a low threshold for frustration, and in situations of high emotional pressure, could overreact. This raised important questions. How far would she be willing to go to protect her son's future? Could she have crossed an irreparable line by feeling that Caleb was standing in the way of Lucas's dreams? When questioned, Priscilla denied any involvement in the crime. According to her testimony, on the night of the murder, she had been at a parents' meeting organized by her youngest daughter's school. Several people corroborated her presence there, but the exact dates and times were still being verified. Although she seemed sincere in her statement, investigators noted a certain stiffness in her tone, as if she was trying too hard to convince them of her innocence. In addition, some minor inconsistencies in witness accounts began to emerge, raising doubts about the strength of her alibi. Without conclusive physical evidence linking her directly to the crime scene, the authorities were at a stalemate. But Priscilla's past behavior was still reason enough to keep her in their sights. Priscilla was a passionate and volatile woman, with a personality that could oscillate between maternal gentleness and restrained anger. Those who knew her well described someone deeply committed to the welfare of her children, but also capable of acting recklessly when she felt they were being treated unfairly. This duality in her nature piqued the curiosity of researchers, who began to wonder whether pent-up resentment toward Caleb might have led her to take drastic measures in a moment of emotional desperation. Was it possible that Priscilla, blinded by anger and fear of losing her son's opportunities, had decided to eliminate the man she perceived as an insurmountable obstacle? Despite suspicions, the lack of physical evidence left many questions unanswered. Muddy footprints found at the crime scene did not match Priscilla's shoes, and forensic analysis failed to establish a direct connection between her and the bloody bat left next to Caleb's body. Still, investigators did not completely rule out her involvement. The broken side window and footprints leading to the back exit of the stadium remained key clues, but none of them pointed directly to Priscilla. Witness testimony supporting her alibi, while compelling on the surface, was not enough to completely exonerate her. Ultimately, Priscilla Rivers remained a central piece in the puzzle of the case, a woman whose unwavering loyalty to her son made her an ambiguous figure in the search for the truth. Darius Cole, a 28-year-old man with an imposing but unsettling presence, was a well-known figure in Oakville, though not exactly for positive reasons. His life had been marked by a series of complicated relationships and questionable decisions that led him to be viewed with suspicion by many in the community. One of the most turbulent chapters of his life was his relationship with Evelyn Hawthorne, Caleb's wife. That relationship, which once seemed full of promise, quickly turned into a stormy bond filled with emotional ups and downs. Darius and Evelyn had shared moments of apparent happiness, but also episodes of tension and arguments that left deep scars on both of them. However, everything changed when Caleb Hawthorne stepped in. As Evelyn's husband and a respected coach, Caleb made a firm decision to forbid any contact between them, arguing that the relationship was negatively affecting their marriage and, more importantly, Evelyn's well-being. This protective act, while well-intentioned, unleashed a firestorm of resentment in Darius. Darius's anger towards Caleb was palpable, even to those who knew him only superficially. According to rumors circulating in the community, Darius blamed Caleb not only for separating him from Evelyn, but also for destroying his happiness. In his mind, Caleb was the villain who had intervened in his private life and taken away something he considered valuable. This distorted perception fueled a deep resentment that, over time, seemed to have morphed into obsession. But Darius's resentment was not limited to Caleb alone. He also extended his bitterness toward Evelyn, whom he accused of abandoning him without giving him a real chance to resolve his problems. This toxic mix of emotions made him a problematic figure in the case, someone whose personal motivations could have led him to cross dangerous boundaries. Suspicions about Darius intensified when investigators discovered suspicious bank transfers made from his account to unknown numbers days before the crime, raising red flags among authorities who began to wonder if they might be related to some sort of blackmail or cover-up attempt. These transactions, though small in amount, raised red flags among authorities, who began to wonder if they might be related to some sort of blackmail or cover-up attempt. Was it possible that Darius had hired someone to carry out the murder? Or were these transfers part of a more complex plan that they had yet to decipher? The lack of clarity surrounding these financial transactions added a new level of intrigue to the case, making Darius an even more relevant suspect. When questioned, Darius claimed to have a solid alibi. According to his account, on the night of the murder, he had been working a night shift at a local gas station. The gas station supervisor did indeed confirm that Darius was present for much of his shift, but admitted that he was briefly absent for about an hour. An hour, investigators thought, was plenty of time to commit a crime as brutal as the one that occurred at the stadium. Although Darius adamantly denied leaving his post for more than a few minutes, the inconsistency in his testimony raised significant doubts. Moreover, the fact that he was unable to provide additional witnesses to corroborate his whereabouts during that interval left a troubling gap in his statement. Darius was an impulsive man, with a tendency to act without thinking about the consequences of his actions. Those who knew him well described someone who rarely controlled his emotions, especially when he felt he had been unfairly treated. This combination of impulsivity and resentment made his profile particularly alarming. Investigators began to wonder whether the pent-up resentment toward Caleb might have reached a boiling point in a moment of blind rage. Had Darius been capable of planning an act as cold and calculated as murder? Or on the contrary, had he acted in an emotional outburst that was completely beyond his control? Despite suspicions, the physical evidence was still insufficient to directly link Darius to the crime scene. Muddy footprints found in the stadium did not match his shoes, and forensic analysis of the bloody bat revealed no connection to him. However, investigators could not ignore the possibility that Darius had worn gloves or changed his shoes to avoid leaving traces. In addition, the suspicious bank transfers remained an unsolved mystery, a loose thread that needed to be tied up. Meanwhile, the gas station supervisor's testimony, while helpful, was inconclusive. The broken side window and the footprints leading to the rear exit of the stadium remained key clues, but neither pointed directly to Darius. Rhett Hawthorne was 44 years old and the younger brother of Caleb, a man whose life seemed to be marked by a series of wrong choices and missed opportunities. From a young age, Rhett had always been seen as restless, someone who was constantly struggling to find his place in the world. While Caleb was building a solid career and earning the respect of those around him, Rhett was living on the edge of chaos, moving between temporary jobs, risky investments, and broken promises. His personality was magnetic but volatile. He could charm anyone with his charisma, but also fade that confidence in an instant with his impulsive actions. He was a man who was always looking for the next big opportunity, even if it rarely turned out to be more than mirages. The relationship between Rhett and Caleb had always been complicated. Although they shared blood ties, their paths had diverged drastically over time. Caleb, 10 years Rhett's senior, had always assumed a protective role toward his younger brother, offering him financial assistance at critical times. However, this generosity was not endless, and Rhett had crossed an invisible line too many times. In recent years, he had borrowed money from Caleb on numerous occasions to pay off debts accumulated from bad investments. These loans, which were initially given with good intentions, began to erode Caleb's patience. According to close friends, Caleb eventually flatly refused to continue helping Rhett, arguing that he had done enough and that it was time for his brother to face the consequences of his own decisions. This refusal caused a temporary rift in their sibling relationship, leaving Rhett resentful and feeling abandoned. What made Rhett particularly interesting in the context of the research was his constant access to the stadium where Caleb worked. As a younger brother, Rhett was well acquainted with Caleb's schedule and routines, as well as the spaces he frequented. He had visited the stadium on multiple occasions, both by invitation and on his own, and knew how to move through the hallways and offices without arousing suspicion. This intimate knowledge of Caleb's environment put him in a privileged position if someone wanted to plan a deliberate act against him. In addition, Rhett had clear reasons to resent his older brother, especially after he decided to cut off the flow of financial aid. For someone in his situation, desperate to get out of financial trouble, any impulsive action might have seemed justified in his mind. When Detective Rowan Ashcroft questioned Rhett, he claimed to be visiting a friend in another city during the estimated time of the crime. He explained that he had left early that day and planned to stay at his friend's house for several days, taking the opportunity to unwind and reflect on his life. However, when asked to provide conclusive evidence of his whereabouts, Rhett was unable to do so. His friend, when contacted by investigators, confirmed that Rhett had mentioned he would come to visit him, but claimed he never showed up. This gap in his alibi left room for doubt. Had he really been on his way to see his friend, or had he used that excuse to cover his true movements? Rhett's potential motive was clear and disturbing. Financial tensions between the two brothers had reached a critical point, and Caleb's refusal to continue helping Rhett could have been the trigger for something much darker. For someone used to relying on his older brother, the loss of that source of support must have been devastating. Rhett might have seen Caleb not only as an obstacle to solving his problems, but as someone who had betrayed him emotionally by withdrawing his support. While there was no direct evidence linking Rhett to the crime, his resentment toward Caleb and his knowledge of the stadium were factors that could not be ignored. During the interrogation, Rhett tried to project an image of calm and cooperation, but there were times when his mask of indifference crumbled. His hands shook slightly when asked about his relationship with Caleb, and he avoided looking directly into the detective's eyes when he talked about the last time they had argued. These small gestures revealed an internal tension that she could hardly hide. Furthermore, his inability to provide hard evidence of his whereabouts placed him in a vulnerable position within the investigation. Rhett's emotional context was crucial to understanding his possible involvement in the case. He was a man caught between pride and despair, struggling to keep afloat a life that seemed to be sinking deeper and deeper. His relationship with Caleb had been a mixture of dependency and resentment, and the recent breakup between them must have left deep scars on his psyche. If Rhett had come to believe that Caleb was to blame for all his problems, he might have felt that eliminating him was the only way to regain control over his destiny. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Rhett was not just another witness. His access to the stadium, his knowledge of Caleb's schedule, and his obvious resentment toward his older brother placed him in an awkward position in the puzzle. Although there was no conclusive evidence linking him directly to the crime, his presence in the case was undeniably significant. Rhett Hawthorne was a man whose decisions and intertwined emotions could have led to a tragic outcome, and although his guilt was not yet proven, his role in the drama could not be ignored. After weeks of exhaustive investigation, the case took an unexpected turn when investigators were able to connect two key pieces of evidence to Rhett Hawthorne. Muddy footprints found at the crime scene were a perfect match to the soles of boots Rhett often wore for outdoor work, while the fragment of torn fabric found next to Jasper Lane's body fit like a jigsaw puzzle to an old but distinctive jacket Rhett had worn for years. These discoveries not only brought investigators closer to the truth, but also sealed Rhett's fate. Under intensive and prolonged interrogation, Rhett finally succumbed to the pressure. With his head down and his voice trembling, he admitted to executing the murder of his own brother, driven by a toxic mix of anger, resentment, and financial desperation. Rhett revealed that he had spent months accumulating debt due to a series of bad investments and risky bets. On several occasions, he had turned to Caleb for financial help, but his brother, known for his firm and disciplined nature, steadfastly refused to continue to support what he considered irresponsible decisions. This refusal marked a breaking point in their sibling relationship, turning years of closeness into bitter resentment. Rhett confessed that his mind began to fill with dark thoughts, seeing Caleb not as his brother, but as the obstacle that kept him trapped in a spiral of failure. Over time, these feelings turned into a coldly calculated plan: eliminate Caleb and, in doing so, free himself from the financial pressure that consumed him. The murder was carefully orchestrated to minimize noise and avoid witnesses. Rhett knew the stadium would be empty after the last game of the night, a time when Caleb was usually left alone to review strategies and plan workouts. Using his intimate knowledge of the place, Rhett crept in through a side window he had deliberately left ajar days earlier. He carried with him an aluminum bat he had taken from storage. This bat, though simple, became the fatal instrument of his revenge. Once inside, Rhett waited patiently in the shadows of the dugout until Caleb appeared, oblivious to the danger that lurked. As his brother leaned over a table to review some documents, Rhett acted with speed and precision, striking him hard in the back of the skull. The impact was brutal and lethal, leaving Caleb lying on the floor, surrounded by objects that once symbolized his passion for baseball. Rhett's arrest marked a before and after in the Oakville community. His confession not only exposed the darkness that can lurk in even the closest of bonds, but also served as a grim reminder of how unresolved conflict can trigger irreparable tragedies. He was sentenced to life in prison for manslaughter, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his actions. For many in Oakville, this case left a profound lesson: the importance of addressing conflict peacefully and constructively before it is too late. Case 5. In the heart of a seemingly perfect town, where the waters of Silvermere Lake reflected the sky like a flawless mirror, and the trees swayed gently with each autumn breeze, something dark began to emerge. Havenwood, Minnesota, a community that breathed tranquility and tradition, was soon shaken by a crime that would shatter its fragile balance. In a remote corner of the woods surrounding the lake, about 2 miles north of the high school, Sarah Miller's fate was sealed in what everyone now knew as the Wolf Glade. This small, open space among the trees, frequented by teenagers in search of late-night campfires and shared laughter, became the epicenter of a tragedy that left deep scars on those who once believed their home was invulnerable. On the October morning when Sarah's lifeless body was discovered, The air was charged with an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was trying to contain the horror of what had happened. The corpse lay face down on a bed of dry leaves and pine needles, partially covered by the previous night's moisture. His clothes, torn and stained with dirt, spoke of a struggle before the murder, a desperate struggle that ended abruptly. Drag marks on the floor were clear, revealing that someone had tried to move the body after the crime, perhaps to hide evidence or simply flee in panic. The dark bruises around her neck told a violent story, a brutal act committed with bare hands, with no visible tools or weapons to explain how such an atrocity was carried out. Near where the body rested, investigators found footprints partially washed away by the rain, mute witnesses to the presence of someone else that fateful night. Among them were the marks of a pair of work boots with a distinctive sole that would soon become a crucial clue. But not everything was limited to footprints. A lighter and a dark blue cloth handkerchief were found in the nearby bushes, objects that seemed out of place in this natural environment. Had they been accidentally left behind during the killer's escape? Or perhaps, some thought, they had been deliberately left behind to confuse those seeking answers. A few meters from the clearing, under an old, twisted tree, whose branches looked like claws, stretched skyward, a black backpack covered with mud and sticky leaves appeared. Inside it, several school notebooks, an empty water bottle, and a smashed cell phone offered additional clues, albeit fragmentary and insufficient to fully reconstruct what had happened. Forensics determined that the body had been at the scene for at least 12 hours, placing the probable time of the murder between 9 and 11 o'clock the previous night. Every detail, from the position of the body to the objects found, seemed designed to hide uncomfortable truths. However, to Remy Charlie, the detective in charge of the investigation, these small clues represented the first step toward the truth. A 42-year-old woman with a piercing gaze and an immaculate reputation, Remy had grown up in Havenwood and knew its shadows and secrets well. Her return to the local police department had not been easy. Haunted by a 5-year-old cold case, the murder of a young mother named Laura Finch, Remy had preferred to stay away from field work. But this new case stirred something inside her, a mixture of determination and fear that the same dark secrets that had devoured Laura had also reached Sarah. When Remy arrived at the clearing, accompanied by her forensic team and a group of local officers, the scene reminded her painfully of that unsolved case. She observed Sarah's body with a mixture of professionalism and empathy, her eyes lingering on the lighter and the handkerchief. He knew that those small details could be the key to unraveling not only this crime, but others that remained hidden in the recesses of the city's history. As he walked slowly around the clearing, inhaling the fresh but disturbing scent of the forest, Remy felt a shiver run down his spine. This case would not just be an investigation. It would be a confrontation with the ghosts of the past and the truths Havenwood refused to face. 31-year-old Sarah Miller was a literature teacher at Havenwood High School. Known for her passion for teaching and her ability to connect with students, Sarah had become a beloved figure both inside and outside the classroom. Originally from Minneapolis, she came to Havenwood 7 years ago after accepting a position at the local school. Her arrival was seen as a breath of fresh air for a community that valued education, but lacked the resources to attract talented teachers. Since then, she has left an indelible mark on her students and colleagues. She lived alone in a small house painted white, with sloping ceilings and wide windows that let in sunlight. This house was located just minutes from Silvermere Lake, a place Sarah often visited to enjoy the tranquility of nature. Although she had no close relatives in Havenwood, her parents resided in Florida, where they maintained a distant relationship since she decided to pursue her academic career away from them. Despite this independence, Sarah always displayed a friendly and open nature. She was active in community events and supported local causes, endearing herself to those who knew her. Professionally, Sarah was admired for her dedication. She organized book clubs for students interested in delving into classic and contemporary authors. In addition, she offered free tutoring to those who needed extra help. However, some rumors suggested that her popularity had also brought her problems. There was talk of quiet rivalries between colleagues jealous of her success and certain students who felt pressure to meet her high expectations. Personally, Sarah maintained a discreet, private life. She had no steady partner, although she occasionally dated men in town, including some of her students' parents. These relationships never lasted long, fueling speculation about her love life. His last day passed normally. She taught until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, attended a school board meeting, and then returned home. She was last seen shortly after 7 in the evening, walking to the lake. Supposedly, she had gone out to enjoy a short evening walk. No one imagined that this would be the last time they would see her alive. The serenity of the lake, which she loved so much, became the scene of her tragic end. With the first clues gathered in the clearing, Remy Charlie knew it was time to delve into the web of relationships and secrets that defined Havenwood. Each inhabitant held a piece of the puzzle, and only through meticulous interrogation could she begin to unravel the truth. Preparing to face conflicting accounts and pent-up emotions, Remy summoned those closest to Sarah, knowing that behind their words and silences lay the key to solving the case. Isaac Caldwell, a 29-year-old man with a stocky build and hands calloused from constant work, was a familiar but not particularly relatable figure to most Havenwood residents. As the high school's official groundskeeper, Isaac devoted long hours to keeping the campus gardens and green spaces pristine, a job he always performed quietly and with almost obsessive meticulousness. His reserved attitude and tendency to avoid social interactions made him difficult to decipher, a mystery walking among the leaves he cut himself. Although he had no criminal record and had not been linked to any major problems, his introverted behavior made him the subject of occasional commentary among local residents, who often speculated about what was really going on in his mind. Isaac's relationship with Sarah Miller was marked by professional tensions that had begun to grow in the months leading up to the crime. Sarah was on the school committee charged with managing funds for campus maintenance, a position that indirectly placed her as an overseer of Isaac's activities. According to testimony from other employees, Isaac had expressed resentment toward Sarah on multiple occasions due to budget cuts that affected his salary and job benefits. These financial adjustments not only reduced his income, but also limited his ability to adequately perform his job, as the resources needed to maintain the gardens became scarce. For Isaac, this represented more than just an economic issue. It was a direct blow to his professional pride and the quality of his work, something he deeply valued. When it came time to be questioned by Detective Remy Charlie, Isaac appeared nervous but tried to maintain a semblance of calm. During questioning, he claimed to have been repairing a faulty sprinkler system on the south side of the school property on the night of Sarah's murder. He explained that he had decided to work late to fix the problem before the malfunctioning system further affected the grounds. However, when Remy asked him for additional details or witnesses who could corroborate his account, Isaac admitted that he had worked alone and had not alerted anyone of his plans. Campus security cameras, thoroughly reviewed by the investigative team, also failed to record his presence in the aforementioned area during the hours in question. This lack of physical evidence raised significant doubts about his alibi. What most caught Remy's attention was the inconsistency in the way Isaac described his nightly routine. At first, he claimed to have finished his work around 9 o'clock at night and returned directly home. However, when asked specifically about the route he had taken, he hesitated and changed his version slightly, mentioning a brief stop at a nearby workshop to buy tools. This detail, though small, seemed out of place considering that Isaac always carried everything he needed for his work. Furthermore, when shown images of the boot prints found near Sarah's body, Isaac paled visibly, although he insisted that his boots were worn and could match many others in the city. As the questioning progressed, it became clear that Isaac harbored deep resentments toward Sarah, resentments that might have escalated beyond simple labor grievances. His answers, though carefully measured, revealed a mixture of frustration and bitterness that he could not fully disguise. Remy knew that although Isaac had no violent background, pent-up hatred and a sense of injustice could be powerful triggers in certain circumstances. As he watched him closely, Remy wondered if Isaac Caldwell was simply a misunderstood man, or if his habitual silence hid something much darker. 34-year-old Grace Winslow was a single mother deeply committed to the welfare of her 2 teenage children. She worked part-time as an event organizer at the local church, a role that reflected her religious devotion and desire to contribute to the community. Known for her strict character and unwavering ethics, Grace stood out for her dedication both at church and in school activities, where she was actively involved as a volunteer. Her presence was commanding, and while many respected her for her tireless work, others perceived her as an intense and, at times, overwhelming figure. Grace had a reputation for being protective to the extreme when it came to her children, who were the center of her life. This fierce protectiveness, while admirable in some respects, also seemed to fuel tensions with those who did not share her view of what she considered best for them. At first, Grace deeply admired Sarah's commitment to education and her ability to inspire students. However, that admiration soon gave way to resentment when one of her children received a low grade in literature. According to close sources, Grace began to criticize Sarah publicly, accusing her of favoring certain students while ignoring or discouraging others, including her own son. During school meetings and community events, several witnesses reported hearing hostile comments from Grace toward Sarah. These criticisms were not limited to private conversations. Grace attempted to engage other parents in a campaign against Sarah, arguing that her teaching methods were too demanding and unapproachable for some students. Although she failed to gain enough support to formalize any official complaints, these actions raised doubts among some members of the community about Sarah's objectivity as a teacher. On the night of the crime, Grace claimed to be at home reviewing homework with her children. According to her testimony, she had spent the evening supervising the academic assignments of both young men, making sure they were fulfilling their responsibilities. Her children backed up this version without hesitation, stating that the entire family had stayed together during those hours. However, upon questioning them separately, Detective Remy Charlie noticed troubling inconsistencies in their accounts. The details provided by each son varied slightly. One mentioned that they had been in the living room, while the other claimed it all happened in the kitchen. In addition, neither could clearly recall which specific subjects they were reviewing or exactly how much time they had spent on each task. These contradictions, while subtle, raised suspicions about the veracity of Grace's alibi. Despite these inconsistencies, there was no direct physical evidence linking Grace to the crime scene. The distinctive boot prints found in the clearing in the woods, the rusted silver lighter, and the dark blue bandana did not match anything related to her. However, her defensive demeanor during interrogations and her history of personal conflicts with Sarah kept her on the suspect list. The intensity of her maternal devotion, combined with her tendency to act impulsively when she felt her children were being unfairly treated, raised inevitable questions about whether such extreme loyalty might have led her to cross a dangerous line. The case of Grace Winslow illustrates how accumulated tensions can erode even the most cordial relationships. Although she was ultimately ruled out as guilty due to a lack of conclusive evidence, her story underscores how personal resentments can become powerful motivations, capable of weaving dangerous narratives. For the Havenwood community, the conflict between Grace and Sarah was a reminder that, beneath the surface of apparent harmony, there are always hidden currents ready to emerge. Julian Ashcroft, a 36-year-old man with a stocky build that reflected years of hard physical labor, was a familiar figure in Havenwood. As the owner of the town's only mechanic shop, his presence was both a necessity and a constant in the lives of many residents. Julian had calloused hands, scarred by the constant use of heavy tools, and an ever-wary gaze that seemed to evaluate those around him before deciding if they were worthy of his attention. Although some loyal customers appreciated his tireless dedication and technical skills, others avoided dealing with him because of his volatile temperament. Julian was not someone who tolerated setbacks or criticism well. When something didn't go his way, his frustration could erupt into unpredictable outbursts that left those who witnessed it uncomfortable and, at times, fearful. The relationship between Julian and Sarah Miller had been strained for several months, although no one would have imagined that this friction could develop into something more serious. According to local rumors, the turning point occurred during a community party organized at the Lake Park, an event attended by many Havenwood residents. That night, Julian approached Sarah with clear intentions, attempting to strike up a conversation that quickly took on a more personal tone. However, when Sarah politely rebuffed his advances, Julian did not accept the rejection graciously. Witnesses recalled how he persisted, visibly annoyed, before retreating with a humiliated expression on his face. The incident did not go unnoticed, and comments soon began to circulate about how Julian had reacted to feeling rejected. Sources close to him claimed that he did not take this type of situation well, and that after the altercation with Sarah, he began to make derogatory comments about her in public. Some even quoted Julian as criticizing successful women who didn't know their place, a phrase that resonated with bitterness and resentment. When it came time to be questioned by Detective Remy Charlie, Julian presented himself in a defensive but apparently cooperative manner. He explained that on the night of the crime, he had been repairing a truck outside of town, a job that he said kept him busy until the wee hours of the morning. His version seemed plausible at first glance, but when Remy and his team investigated further, they discovered that the alleged client had no record of soliciting services that night. This finding placed Julian under greater scrutiny as his alibi turned out to be extremely weak. Furthermore, when questioned about specific details of the alleged job, Julian hesitated, offering vague answers that did not quite match the operational reality of his shop. What most caught Remy's attention was the inconsistency in his demeanor during the interrogation. Julian, while trying to maintain a facade of calm, showed signs of nervousness whenever details related to the night of the crime were mentioned. His normally steady hands trembled slightly when shown images of boot prints found near Sarah's body. Although Julian denied any involvement in the murder, his evasive attitude and inability to provide a solid alibi raised significant doubts. Remy knew that wounded pride and resentment could be powerful triggers, especially in someone with as explosive a temperament as Julian's. As she watched him closely, Remy couldn't help but wonder if that rejection at the lake park had been the catalyst for something much darker, something Julian was not yet willing to reveal. 27-year-old Lila Monroe was an ambitious young woman who worked as an administrative assistant at the high school. Known for her efficiency and ability to solve problems quickly, Lila was respected by the teaching staff and valued for her ability to maintain order in an often chaotic environment. However, behind that polished professional image, she was rumored to harbor dark secrets related to her past, although no one could confirm them with certainty. Her impeccable appearance and dedication to work seemed to be a mask concealing deep insecurities and unbridled ambition. Despite her youth, Lila had managed to position herself as a key figure within the administrative team, but her constant need for validation suggested that her success did not provide the satisfaction she craved. According to close observations, Lila was often intimidated by Sarah's confidence and natural charisma. While Sarah shined at school gatherings and community events, Lila struggled to find her place in that same setting. Office colleagues mentioned that Lila showed signs of insecurity whenever Sarah received public accolades, whether for her innovative teaching strategies or her positive impact on students. These pent-up emotions seemed to fuel silent resentments, which generated barely concealed rivalry. In addition, Lila had been involved in petty internal squabbles within the administrative team, constantly seeking to position herself as indispensable. Her obsession to stand out and control situations even led her to monitor Sarah's movements, according to documents found in the abandoned backpack near the forest clearing. Those papers suggested that Lila was looking for mistakes or weaknesses in Sarah that could be used against her. On the night of the crime, Lila stated that she was at home watching television. She lived alone, so there were no direct witnesses who could corroborate her version. However, she claimed to have ordered food at home around 9 p.m., a detail she tried to use as an alibi. Restaurant records confirmed the order but did not establish exactly when it was delivered or whether Lila was present at the time. This inconsistency in her testimony raised doubts about her actual whereabouts during those crucial hours. Although there was no physical evidence linking Lila to the crime scene, her behavior during the interrogations raised suspicions. She appeared nervous, avoided looking investigators in the eye, and offered vague answers when asked for specific details about her nightly routine. The case of Lila Monroe reveals how inordinate ambition can lead to insidious behavior. Her need to excel and her envy of Sarah may have driven her to cross ethical boundaries, even if there is no conclusive evidence directly connecting her to the murder. The tensions between them were palpable, but they also reflect a broader dynamic within the community, the relentless competition for recognition and power. For Havenwood, Lila's case was an unsettling reminder that even those who seem most committed to their work can hide hidden motivations, capable of emerging at the most unexpected moments. The investigation proceeded with grueling slowness, as Remy Charlie pieced together scattered clues, analyzed conflicting testimony, and searched for connections between the smallest details. Each suspect seemed to have plausible motives for wanting Sarah Miller silent, but evidence that could link any of them directly to the crime remained elusive. It was then that two seemingly insignificant objects found in the forest clearing took center stage: a lighter and a dark blue handkerchief. These items, abandoned in the bushes near Sarah's body, became the key to unraveling the truth. The forensic laboratory performed a meticulous analysis of both objects. Partial fingerprints were identified on the lighter, whose metal surfaces still bore traces of grease and sweat. To the investigating team's surprise, these marks matched those of Isaac Caldwell, the high school groundskeeper. Initially, Isaac had denied any connection to the crime scene, arguing that he had only been in the clearing days before the murder to cut wood. However, this new evidence placed Isaac under much closer scrutiny. In addition, analysis of boot prints found on the ground near the body revealed that they belonged to a specific model commonly used in heavy work, such as those performed by gardeners. This discovery was a devastating blow to Isaac's alibi, who up to that point had maintained an attitude of feigned innocence. When Remy confronted Isaac with this information, his demeanor changed drastically. The man, who until then had displayed a forced calmness, began to sweat profusely. His hands trembled slightly as he stammered unconvincing excuses, trying to justify his presence in the clearing without admitting any involvement in the crime. The tension in the room was palpable, and Remy knew he was close to a confession. Finally, after hours of exhaustive questioning, Isaac collapsed emotionally. With tears in his eyes and his voice cracking, he admitted to following Sarah into the clearing that night, driven by a mixture of pent-up anger and financial resentment. According to his account, a heated argument resulted in an accidental struggle. In a fit of blind rage, he lost control and strangled Sarah with his bare hands. After the fact, he desperately tried to cover his tracks by dragging the body to a less visible location and inadvertently dropping the lighter and handkerchief. Sarah Miller's murder was committed in an emotional outburst fueled by financial and personal resentments. Isaac had not planned the crime. He acted in a moment of total loss of control, using his bare hands as a weapon. This detail supported the theory of an impulsive crime without tools or premeditation. However, his subsequent behavior, dragging the body, trying to hide evidence, and lying about his whereabouts, demonstrated a clear intention to cover up what had happened. For the court, these factors justified serious charges despite the initial lack of planning. The case deeply shook Havenwood, exposing the cracks hidden beneath its seemingly idyllic surface. For Remy Charlie, solving Sarah's murder meant more than closing a file. It was a reminder that even in small, seemingly quiet communities, secrets can be lethal. As he watched Isaac being escorted out of the interrogation room, Remy felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sadness. Although the case was solved, the scars he left on the community would remain for a long time, a reminder that behind every smile can hide an unexpected shadow. The trial of Isaac Caldwell took place in a tense and emotionally charged atmosphere, with the small courtroom packed with Havenwood residents seeking answers and justice. Over the previous weeks, the details of the case had dominated conversations in town, dividing some between the desire to understand what had driven Isaac to commit such an act and the need to see him held accountable for his actions. On the stand, Isaac seemed a shadow of the man he once was. His gaze avoided those present, his hands trembled slightly, and his voice was barely audible as he admitted his guilt in front of the judge. The prosecutor argued that, although the crime had not been premeditated, Isaac's subsequent actions demonstrated a clear intent to cover up what had happened. Dragging Sarah's body, leaving evidence in the clearing, and repeatedly lying about his whereabouts made it clear that he knew what he had done was wrong, and that he tried to avoid detection. The manual strangulation executed in a blind rage was described as a brutal act that reflected a total loss of control, but also inexcusable violence. The defense, for its part, attempted to present the crime as a tragic accident driven by the accumulation of financial and personal resentments. They argued that Isaac had never shown violent tendencies before, and that the murder was the result of an irrational moment of weakness. However, these words resonated little with the court, especially considering the lack of genuine remorse shown by Isaac during his confession. Finally, the jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty of aggravated manslaughter. The judge handed down a 25-year prison sentence, noting the seriousness of the crime and the need to protect the community. For many in Havenwood, this decision marked the closing of a dark chapter, though the scars remained. Isaac was transferred to a state penitentiary, where he would face long years of forced reflection on the consequences of his uncontrolled rage. For Remy Charlie, the trial represented another reminder of human frailty and the importance of seeking justice without losing sight of empathy. Although the case was closed, she knew Havenwood would never be the same.